They burned kingdoms, enslaved nations, and made Europe tremble. But one morning in 842, the Vikings did something unthinkable. They ran. 30 longships turned away from the Scottish coast, not from storms or defeat, but from fear. Because waiting beyond the mist was the only tribe they could never conquer, the Painted Ones. Warriors who didn't fight for gold or glory, but for mastery, of silence, of terrain, of terror itself. This was the day when the conquerors of Europe met a people who had perfected fear. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The sea that morning was unnaturally still. Mist hung low over the water, turning the horizon into a wall of white. Beneath it, the carved dragon heads of Viking ships emerged and disappeared like shadows on a grave. For these men, silence was unfamiliar. Their lives were defined by noise, the crack of oars, the clash of steel, the screams of the conquered. Yet now, even the wind had chosen not to speak. At the front of the fleet stood Magnus Bloodaxe, a chieftain whose raids were recited in sagas from Ireland to Byzantium. He had crossed seas, burned monasteries, and taken kings hostage. For Magnus, fear had always belonged to others. But as his ships neared the coast, his warriors began to sense something they could not name. No watchfires, no fleeing villagers, no sound of life at all. Then they saw them, faint outlines on the cliffs, bodies painted blue from head to toe. The figures did not move, did not shout, did not raise weapons. They simply watched. Their stillness was unbearable. The Vikings had faced legions and fortresses, but never silence this deliberate, this surgical. The scouts returned shaken. They spoke of stone towers built at impossible angles, of trenches cut with mathematical precision, of pathways that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if the land itself had been shaped to observe, to trap, to kill. Magnus ordered a landing. Pride demanded it. But even as oars struck the water, something in the air changed. A density, like breath before thunder. The warriors rowed in disciplined rhythm, yet no sound returned from the shore. The sea swallowed their noise. When the keels finally scraped against sand, no resistance came. The beach was empty, save for scattered footprints leading inland. Still, every man felt eyes upon him. The ground was too smooth, the silence too heavy. Then came the first sign, a raven's call, sharp and distant. To a Viking, the raven was a herald of Odin, a sign of victory. But this cry echoed once, then vanished. No answer followed. It was a sound not of blessing, but of warning. Magnus looked toward the cliffs, toward the motionless blue figures above. He did not yet know their name, Picts, nor the centuries of defense written into their stones. He only understood one thing. These were not victims waiting to die. They were architects of fear. And before the day was done, even the fiercest men of the North would understand what it meant to face an enemy who fought not with rage, but with patience. For most of Europe, Viking warfare was a storm. It struck without warning, consumed everything, and vanished before resistance could organize. Their strategy relied on predictability. Chaos delivered with precision. Villages burned not because of need, but because fire traveled faster than rumor. fear itself was logistics. The Picts had studied that pattern. For generations, they had watched the longships carve the horizon, recording how the raiders moved, how quickly they built camps, where they disembarked, how they chose their targets. They did not meet the Vikings in open combat, they redesigned the land around them. The first defenders Magnus Bloodaxe sent ashore reported no enemy lines, no banners, no fortifications of wood. Instead, they found geometry, the quiet kind drawn in stone and earth. Circular watchtowers stood where cliffs curved inward, forcing ships to approach through narrow arcs of visibility. Trenches divided the beach into corridors that trapped men in straight paths while concealing archers in the ridges above. Every angle had purpose. Every silence had structure. It was not fortification for strength. It was fortification for control. When the first Viking formation advanced inland, they moved with the confidence of experience. The shields locked, the axes gleamed, and the chant of war began. Yet, within moments, the formation began to dissolve. Not from arrows, but from absence. Paths that seemed clear moments ago folded into dead ends. The ground shifted under their boots. What they thought were roads were drainage trenches disguised with grass. Some led back toward the sea, others deeper into labyrinths of unseen pits. Every misstep widened the gap between units. By the time Magnus realized the separation, it was too late. The Picts had transformed the battlefield into an equation. Movement equals exposure. Hesitation equals survival. The Vikings were caught in a system that rewarded stillness, a behavior they had never learned. From the cliffs, the Painted Ones watched. They did not taunt. They did not shout. Their faces, covered in spirals of woad, reflected no emotion. To the raiders, those blue lines seemed alive, bending and writhing through the mist. In truth, they served a practical function, patterns designed to distort distance and shape, so that a single warrior appeared as a dozen, and a dozen vanished like smoke. Every aspect of their defense combined engineering with psychology. Towers positioned at irregular intervals prevented the enemy from estimating range. Fire pits disguised as natural hollows could ignite in seconds, creating sudden light to blind night raids. Even the silence had rhythm. No birds, no livestock, as if the environment itself obeyed command. To outsiders, it looked like superstition. To historians, it was infrastructure. The Vikings, masters of intimidation, now faced an enemy who had industrialized composure. Magnus ordered his men to regroup, but command could not function in a landscape that refused to echo. Shouts scattered in fog. Horn calls were absorbed by stone walls. The very acoustics turned against them. Then the first body appeared, not from a strike, but from a fall. A soldier, running through what he believed to be a clearing, plunged into a pit of sharpened stakes. His scream broke the silence, but only for a heartbeat. When the others reached him, he was already gone beneath the weight of his armor. The Vikings looked around. No archers, no enemy. Only the wind, whispering through the trenches they had mistaken for paths. Magnus understood then that he was not fighting men, but architecture. The Picts had transformed defense into art, a composition of angles, sound, and fear. Every death was a data point, measured, observed, repeated. As daylight faded, the fog thickened again, erasing the coastline from view. Somewhere beyond it, the Painted Ones waited for night. Viking warriors, who once measured time by the distance between battles, now waited for dawn like condemned men counting breaths. That night, torches burned low along the shore. The raiders formed a circle, blades drawn, but no attack came. The Picts never struck from impulse. They struck when confidence returned. And that was the true design of their war, not to defeat the enemy's body, but to dismantle his certainty. When morning came, the beach was covered in footprints that led inland, prints that had not been there hours before. Each step was deliberate, evenly spaced, leading toward the misted highlands. Magnus stared at them in silence. He understood the message. Follow us, if you dare. The land remembers more than blood. He would, because pride demands pursuit, and pursuit was exactly what the Picts had built for. They called them the Painted Ones, not as insult, but as warning. To the Vikings, body paint meant ritual, chaos, and tribal vanity. To the Picts, it was language. Every line on their skin held information: clan, rank, distance, terrain. What looked like madness was a code, and Magnus Bloodaxe had sailed straight into its syntax. As the morning fog began to rise, the cliffs above the bay came alive. Hundreds of figures stood motionless, their skin glistening blue under the sun. From below they seemed spectral, their shapes blending with the stone itself. It was impossible to tell where man ended and the landscape began. When they finally moved, it was not as individuals, but as currents. Waves of motion directed by invisible rhythm. The Vikings tightened their ranks, expecting a frontal assault. None came. The painted warriors advanced to the ridge, then disappeared into the folds of the hills. For an instant, it looked as if they had melted into the earth. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was choreography. Every absence meant position. Every gap was intent. Magnus's men were trained to dominate by spectacle. Their armor flashed, their chants thundered, their presence was overwhelming. But what they faced here was the inverse. Power expressed through removal. The Picts fought by denying the Vikings the one thing they understood best: an audience. The first real attack came at noon. A line of raiders marching inland along a narrow gully suddenly collapsed into chaos. The slope beneath them gave way, revealing hidden trenches packed with sharpened stakes. Arrows fell, not from the sky, but from the sides, fired through slit-like openings carved into rock. By the time Magnus reached the scene, the path was unrecognizable. The same geometry he had admired from the sea had now turned into an execution chamber. The Picts never charged, they adjusted. They fought through design, not fury. Their weapons were simple: spears, short blades, and the terrain itself. Every strike was coordinated, every retreat deliberate. Their aim was not extermination, but erosion, to wear down cohesion, to make the invincible uncertain. For centuries, the Vikings had believed that courage and noise could overpower fear. The Picts inverted that logic. They built fear as structure, layer upon layer of anticipation, until the enemy's imagination did the killing for them. Every Viking who fell left more than a corpse. He left a message to the men beside him. You are next, and you won't even see from where. Magnus tried to adapt. He split his force into smaller units, hoping to flank the invisible enemy. but every path mirrored another. Every ridge looked the same. By dusk, his scouts were reporting movements behind them, footsteps without origin, shadows that flickered where no light existed. When night finally came, the hills began to hum, low, rhythmic, like drums buried underground. The Vikings gripped their weapons, scanning the dark. The sound wasn't attack, it was pulse, the steady cadence of warriors marking time until their prey broke. It worked. At dawn, the men who had once crossed continents now refused to leave the beach. They muttered about spirits, cursed the fog, accused the gods of betrayal. Magnus saw the fear spreading faster than any wound. The Picts had achieved what no empire ever had. They had made the Vikings doubt themselves. Archaeologists later uncovered fragments of Pictish fortifications from this period. Concentric walls aligned with natural contours, carved with spirals that echoed on weapons and skin alike. Some scholars dismissed them as art. Others, studying the patterning of visibility and light, realized they were mathematical, early experiments in perception warfare. The painted warriors weren't just defending land, they were defending knowledge. Their art was data, their silence doctrine. Even Roman generals, centuries before, had struggled against these same highlands. But the Vikings, armed with arrogance instead of strategy, had assumed the land would bow to their momentum. It didn't. It absorbed it, then turned it back. By the third night, Magnus's army was no longer an army. Discipline dissolved into superstition. Some swore they saw blue figures walking over fire. Others claimed the mist spoke in voices. None dared pursue further inland. The Picts didn't need to fight another battle. The battle was already psychological. And once fear entered the Norse mind, it never truly left. When Magnus finally ordered retreat, the sea greeted him like judgment. The wind that had once carried his victories now carried silence. As the longships pushed from shore, no enemy followed. Only the sound of drums fading in the distance, steady, patient, unbroken. The Vikings had come to conquer a tribe. They left having met something larger, a civilization that had turned defense into philosophy. The Painted Ones did not win through strength. They won through comprehension, understanding that true power lies not in destruction, but in teaching the destroyer to hesitate. In that hesitation, the legend of Viking invincibility began to fracture. And somewhere in those highlands, beneath layers of stone and time, the Picts continued their quiet work, rewriting the meaning of fear, one silence at a time. By the fourth day, the Vikings realized they were fighting something invisible. Not an army, not even a people, but a place. The Scottish Highlands had ceased to be landscape and had become a mind, observing, remembering, adapting. Magnus Bloodaxe, a commander who had survived the fortresses of Ireland and the storms of the North Sea, now stood surrounded by hills that seemed to think. Every ridge, every pool of water, every silence carried intention. The Picts had turned geography into architecture, a weapon that required no maintenance, no mercy, no fatigue. Paths led nowhere, echoes misdirected sound, and valleys swallowed voices. Even the air betrayed the invaders, dense with mist that concealed direction and distorted depth. The terrain itself became a strategist, and its logic was patience. The first proof came when Magnus ordered a full advance inland. His men climbed through narrow ravines bordered by cliffs that looked stable. Then, without warning, one wall broke away, not by accident, but by design. Stone wedges had been placed deep within cracks, triggered by the movement of weight across hidden ropes. The avalanche that followed buried 30 men in seconds. When they dug out the dead, they found no attackers, only carved wooden pegs arranged in precise intervals, as if the mountain had executed a command. It was the first time the Vikings encountered an automated defense. In their own world, traps were crude, pits, stakes, simple snares. What they saw here was engineering, terrain pre-programmed for violence, and still, no enemy appeared. At night, distant fires blinked from the cliffs, deliberate signals that mimicked the constellations above. When the Vikings moved toward them, they found nothing but cold ashes and footprints that circled back toward their own camp. They were being studied, measured, manipulated. Magnus began to understand that this was not improvisation. It was bureaucracy. Every trap, every delay, every missing man followed a sequence. Somewhere, someone was recording results. The same efficiency that built Roman roads and Viking trade routes had been applied here to the geometry of fear. The next day brought rain. The ground turned to mud, slowing the armored warriors, while the Picts, barefoot, lightly clothed, glided across the slopes. Occasionally, a flash of blue appeared at the edge of vision. By the time a weapon was raised, the figure was gone. The Vikings fired arrows into the mist. Each one returned with silence. The enemy did not waste arrows. They waited until exhaustion made aim impossible. By dusk, Magnus had lost control of time itself. The rhythm of march, attack, rest, all the foundations of his discipline had dissolved. His men no longer knew whether they were advancing or retreating. That uncertainty was the battlefield. One account preserved in Norse oral tradition describes what came next. We walked through a valley of bones that were not buried, but arranged. Spears in circles, shields upright in the ground like gravestones. We thought it warning, but the warning was for them, not us. The Picts had built a museum of failure. Weapons and armor from previous Viking expeditions, polished, preserved, positioned along the ridges. Every relic whispered, "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." The psychological precision was devastating. Vikings believed memory was immortality. To erase one's story was worse than death. The Picts weaponized that belief. By collecting remnants, they reduced each invasion to data. No sagas, no glory, only exhibits in a library of defeat. That night, the raiders set fires across their camp to ward off unseen hunters. The flames crackled, but the mist thickened instead of clearing. At some unseen signal, the wind shifted. The fires flickered and died, smothered by damp air. The darkness that followed was total. Then came the sound, not drums this time, but whispers carried through hollow stones placed around the valley. Each gust of wind turned them into faint voices, echoing the cries of the Vikings who had died earlier. The Picts had built wind instruments from the bones of the fallen, tuned to human breath. The air itself had joined the fight. Magnus fell to his knees, clutching a handful of earth soaked with rain and ash. He realized the truth too late. This was not a war zone. It was an experiment. The Picts had designed their homeland as an intelligent system of deterrence, capable of recording, adjusting, and perfecting. Every failure they endured had taught the land how to respond. When dawn returned, half the camp was gone. No bodies, no blood, just empty spaces where warriors had stood. The survivors whispered that the mist had taken them. Magnus understood better. The land had simply erased them, folded them into its own archive. For the first time, he gave the order that no Viking leader had ever spoken before. Do not advance. The ground is not ours. In the silence that followed, he could hear water dripping through the stone, a rhythm too deliberate to be chance. The land was listening and remembering. The world's most feared warriors had met an enemy that required no army. The mist never lifted again. For 3 days, it clung to the ridges like breath on glass. Magnus Bloodaxe no longer measured time by the sun, but by disappearance. Every few hours, another man was gone. No sound, no struggle, only absence. Their weapons remained. Their footprints ended mid-step. Their names were swallowed by the fog. At first, Magnus believed it was desertion. Fear had unmade loyalty before. But when he followed one of the trails himself, he found something else. A path that bent unnaturally, guiding him toward a valley of oaks blackened by age. There, in the damp earth, stood rows of stones carved with spirals and lines that seemed to move when light touched them. Between the stones hung remnants of armor, weapons, and trinkets. Viking craft unmistakable in its detail. He knew those emblems, the serpent motifs of Danish clans, the wolf sigils of the Norwegians. None of these men had returned home. This was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard of memory, and a warning carved in geometry. Each carving on the stones told a sequence: ships arriving, men landing, formations advancing, then vanishing into waves of blue lines. The symbols grew fainter toward the top, as if the artists had run out of space or mercy. One stone showed something impossible, a depiction of Magnus's own longships, their dragon heads carved exactly as they appeared below. The paint was still wet. He staggered back, breath shallow. Either the Picts had known of his coming long before he arrived, or they had recorded it as it happened. Both possibilities meant the same thing. The Vikings were not fighting in the present. They were walking through a story already written. The men who followed him into the grove fell silent. No one spoke. No one dared touch the stones. They understood instinctively that this place was not built for the living. It was a ledger. Every raid accounted for, every death catalogued, every arrogance balanced with its price. In the Empire of Fear, the Picts were accountants. Archaeologists would later find that the grove matched older ritual sites. Circles aligned with solstices, used for recording harvests, births, eclipses. But at some point, the records changed. The same stones began tracking invasions. Each spiral corresponded not to a season, but to a campaign. What began as agriculture had evolved into warfare, the measurement of threat instead of grain. Magnus knelt beside one of the stones, tracing its cold surface. In that moment, the mythology of his world, of strength, conquest, and divine favor, collapsed. The Picts did not fear him. They had studied him. They had reduced the chaos of war into repetition, turning each Viking raid into an equation whose outcome never changed. His enemy was not hate, it was mastery. As the wind moved through the grove, the hanging armor clinked softly, not as echo, but as clockwork. The sound counted the distance between hubris and history. Magnus's second-in-command urged retreat. But retreat too had been calculated. The Picts had arranged the stones to face the sea, the spiral paths leading outward in such perfect alignment that anyone who followed them would circle back to the same clearing. There was no way out, only repetition. By nightfall, panic became epidemic. Men began destroying the stones, shouting that they were cursed. Axes shattered against rock that did not break. Sparks flared and died in the mist. The more they struck, the louder the grove seemed to hum, as if the earth itself was answering each blow with quiet defiance. Magnus ordered them to stop. The noise had drawn attention. From the edge of the valley came movement. Blue figures emerging from the mist, walking in silence. Their faces bore no rage, no triumph, only the stillness of inevitability. Behind them, torches flared along the ridges, outlining the valley in fire. The Picts had been waiting for the Vikings to finish their own ritual, destruction as confession. Now the execution could begin. But there was no battle. The blue-painted warriors approached slowly, then halted. They left a single gap between their ranks, a corridor leading deeper into the forest. Magnus realized it was not an ambush. It was an invitation. He understood what it meant. Those who entered that corridor would not return. Yet to stay was to drown in fear, to rot inside the grove's silence. For a man who had built his legend on defiance, there was only one choice. He stepped forward. Behind him, no one followed. The Picts closed their ranks, sealing the passage. When dawn came, his men found his helmet beside one of the stones, its surface marked with a spiral drawn in blue. Beneath it, fresh carvings had appeared. Another line added to the record. That morning, the remaining Vikings fled toward the coast. The mist swallowed them in silence, and none looked back. When their ships finally reached open water, they saw the cliffs of Scotland glowing faintly under the sunrise, the blue patterns still visible even from the sea. No arrows, no pursuit, no triumphal cries, just design, quiet, deliberate, eternal. The Picts had won not by force, but by authorship. They didn't destroy the Vikings, they edited them out. And for the first time in Norse history, fear became permanent, a memory that survived longer than the men who felt it. 25 years later, another fleet crossed the Northern Sea. New leader, same certainty. Eric the Red-Handed, a warrior famed for burning Irish abbeys and leaving rivers of iron and blood behind, set sail toward the frozen coast of Finland. The sagas say he sought furs, amber, and slaves. But what he found was the end of Viking certainty. The forests there were not like the woods of Britain or Francia. They were vast, unmapped, and eerily symmetrical. Every tree mirrored another, every sound returned as echo. To the Vikings, this silence felt primitive. To the Sami, it was intelligent. They had lived with it for millennia and knew how to make it listen. Eric's scouts landed first, dragging their ships over the ice-slicked beach. The snow looked untouched, yet faint grooves marked the surface, not footprints, but trails so even they seemed drawn with purpose. When his men followed them inland, the tracks split in impossible directions. No matter which path they chose, they found themselves back at the shore. The forest was folding around them. At first, they blamed the weather. Then came the disappearances. One sentry vanished before dawn, his spear still planted in the snow. Another went to relieve him and never returned. When the search party arrived, they found only a trail of red drops frozen into glass. No bodies, no prints, only the whisper of wind through branches, the same whisper repeating, as if imitating their speech. The Sami were close, but unseen. They moved through the snow without weight, gliding on long wooden slats that left no impression, the world's earliest skis. While the Vikings trudged, sinking knee-deep with each step, the hunters floated above the surface, silent as smoke. Their clothing, white, fur-lined, seamless, made them invisible. They were not simply hiding in the environment, they were the environment. By the second night, Eric realized the forest was alive with intelligence. Fires would not burn, torches flickered and died without reason. The compasses they brought, crude but functional, spun in circles. Even the stars disappeared behind veils of snow. The world had become a closed system, one designed to confuse, tire, and consume. When the first attack came, it was not with weapons, but with sound. A horn call, deep, slow, and distant, echoed across the frozen valley. The Vikings responded with their own horn, but the echo shifted pitch, mimicking them. Then again, and again, until dozens of horns answered from every direction, all identical to their own. Eric shouted orders, but no one could tell which commands were real. The forest had stolen his voice. When dawn arrived, half his men were missing. Their camp remained untouched. Food, tools, even silver ornaments left behind. It wasn't robbery, it was demonstration. The message was the same one the Picts had written in stone: "You are being observed." That day, Eric sent out his fastest warriors to find the enemy. Hours later, they returned pale, shaking, unable to speak. One finally stammered, "They do not fight, they erase." Behind him, in the distance, a figure appeared. Tall, wrapped in white, moving in slow, deliberate steps. Then it stopped, lifted its hand, and vanished into the snow. Eric's men began marking trees to track their routes. By evening, every mark was gone. When they retraced their steps, they found the marks redrawn, inverted, mirrored, as though the forest had rewritten their passage. They were trapped inside a mind capable of editing reality. The Sami had no fortresses, no cities, no written language. Yet, their system of defense surpassed anything the Norse had faced. Where the Picts built architecture, the Sami built psychology. They understood that fear thrives in proportion to uncertainty. To make the invincible tremble, you do not strike, you wait. As night fell again, the Vikings saw movement in the dark, flickers of pale shapes circling the camp. Then silence. No footsteps, no breathing, only snow settling on the canvas of their tents. Hours passed. When morning came, 3 more men were missing. Their bedrolls were undisturbed. Their weapons still lay beside them. Eric did not order pursuit. He stared at the trees, tall, endless, identical, and whispered the first confession of his life. The forest is watching us. It wasn't superstition, it was fact. Every sound carried. Every reflection in the ice revealed position. Every mistake became a signal. The Sami had learned to turn survival into warfare, a discipline that required no cruelty, only precision. By the fifth night, the survivors were begging to retreat. Erik refused. Pride was a chain heavier than any armor. He led a final charge toward a clearing that glowed faintly through the snow. There, they found nothing, just rows of spears buried upright in the ice, forming a spiral pattern identical to those carved in the Pictish stones hundreds of miles away. The message was unmistakable. This was not coincidence. The same principle governed both worlds: geometry as deterrence, silence as weapon, fear as law. Erik stared into the pattern until his torch died. When the darkness settled, he finally understood. The forest did not need to kill them all. It only needed to make them believe it could. And that was enough to end a legend. By the sixth night, the forest had no need to strike. It had already won. The Vikings no longer marched. They drifted. Half-frozen men wrapped in furs that trapped more fear than warmth. Their axes, once extensions of their will, now hung heavy and useless. They no longer looked for the enemy. They looked for proof that the world still recognized them. In every direction, the landscape repeated itself. Trees cloned by snow, shadows looping endlessly. Even their footprints, pressed deep in the ice, vanished within minutes. It was as if the forest refused to remember them. That was the first stage of the Sami's warfare: erasure. They didn't ambush, they deleted. To erase an enemy was more effective than to kill him. A corpse inspires vengeance. Disappearance breeds madness. Erik the Red-Handed watched his army dissolve one man at a time. Each morning, the line of tents grew shorter. No struggle, no sound, just subtraction. At first, he forbade fires, thinking the glow exposed them. Then he ordered fires lit again, desperate for warmth. The contradiction itself was victory. Indecision multiplied through fear. The Sami understood something no empire had ever grasped. Violence creates stories. Every slash and scream gives history a shape. So, they chose not to wound. They replaced warfare with silence, a form of dominance that left no narrative behind. Even their tools were designed to disappear, skis leaving no trail, weapons carved from bone that blended with the snow when dropped. By the seventh day, the Vikings had lost orientation, hierarchy, and speech. Orders turned into murmurs, murmurs into prayer. They spoke to gods who no longer answered, to ancestors who couldn't find them in this endless white. Then they saw it, the first body. A man sitting against a tree, his helmet beside him, hands open on his knees. His eyes were closed, his mouth calm, as if he had fallen asleep. There were no wounds, no frostbite, no marks of struggle. He was frozen in perfect peace. To Erik, it was the most gratifying sight of his life. Because this was not murder. It was surrender. Precise, gentle, absolute. The man had not been taken by violence, but by invitation. Somehow, the forest had convinced him to stop resisting. Erik ordered the body buried, but the ground was frozen. So they covered him with branches and moved on. though the image stayed with them, the serenity of a man who had lost the instinct to survive. That serenity spread like contagion. More men began to wander alone into the dark, whispering to themselves, laying down their weapons before they vanished. No one knew whether they had gone mad or achieved some grim understanding of the enemy. At last, Eric faced what every conqueror fears most, a war that cannot be fought. He couldn't find the enemy's camp, couldn't predict their pattern, couldn't retaliate. He could only endure, and endurance was not a Viking virtue. On the 10th day, a snowstorm fell, silent, deliberate, endless. Visibility vanished beyond a few paces. The wind carved shapes in the drifts that looked almost human, and soon the men began to see movement where there was none. They swung their weapons at ghosts and struck only snow. By the time the blizzard cleared, 5 more were gone. In the heart of the forest, Eric found a clearing where animal bones were arranged in spirals. He remembered the same shape from the Scottish stones. A pattern of control, order imposed upon chaos. He realized with chilling clarity that these people, separated by hundreds of miles and centuries of isolation, shared a single philosophy. That true power is the ability to dictate perception. The Sami didn't need empires, armies, or chronicles. They only needed the landscape, a living instrument that obeyed their precision. Every gust of wind, every reflection, every misplaced echo was calibrated to teach intruders humility. Eric tried to adapt, but fear erodes structure faster than cold. The men began arguing about direction, accusing each other of betrayal. Their weapons turned inward. The first Viking to die by his own comrade's hand did so not out of anger, but confusion, a shadow mistaken for movement. When the Sami finally appeared, they didn't attack. A dozen of them emerged from the trees, silent, faces pale with frost, eyes unreadable. They stood watching as the remaining Vikings stumbled, shouted, and fell. They moved closer, only to retrieve what the dead had left behind. Iron, cloth, fire. Then they disappeared again, leaving nothing disturbed. The confrontation was so brief that some survivors later questioned whether it had happened at all. When spring thawed the snow, Finnish hunters found scattered remains, armor half buried, shields splintered, bones arranged deliberately in circles. No signs of battle, no piles of corpses, just quiet order, as though the dead had been catalogued, not slain. Centuries later, Norse sagas would call this place Skogardöden, the forest that kills without killing. To the Sami, it needed no name. It was simply home. They hadn't defeated the Vikings through strength. They had refined fear into a discipline so pure it no longer required violence. And in doing so, they had taught the most terrifying lesson any warrior could learn: that sometimes the deadliest victory is to let your enemy destroy himself. When spring returned, the sea thawed before the forests did. Weeks passed before the first Viking ship was sighted again along the Baltic coast. It carried only 12 men, frostbitten, silent, eyes hollow with something colder than ice. They spoke little, and when they did, their words made no sense. They claimed the snow had eyes, that the forest breathed, that their comrades had been taken by silence itself. Most dismissed them as mad, but those who examined the ship noticed something worse. The hull bore no battle marks, no signs of conflict. The enemy had never touched them. The forest alone had done the work. Other fleets sent north to investigate found only fragments, tents half buried, shields embedded in ice, tools laid neatly in spirals as if arranged for study. There were no graves, no bones, no ashes, just absence made visible. To the Norse world, this was unthinkable. Vikings defined existence through record, through sagas, trophies, scars. To vanish without story was to lose one's soul. The Sami had weaponized that truth. They hadn't merely defeated their invaders, they had edited them out. No chronicles, no survivors capable of coherent memory, no evidence of conquest. Only rumor that somewhere in the north, a people lived so perfectly in tune with nature that nature itself refused to betray them. In later years, when Christian monks transcribed the surviving fragments of oral testimony, they noticed a pattern in the language of the survivors. The men didn't speak of enemies. They spoke of echoes, movements, reflections. Their vocabulary had shifted from warfare to geometry, an instinctive echo of the precision that had destroyed them. One chronicler recorded, "They feared not death, but forgetting. They said the snow kept their names and whispered them away." That single sentence captured the essence of the Sami defense. Unlike the Picts, who used architecture and ritual, the Sami weaponized continuity, the refusal to give history what it demanded: spectacle. Empires survive by recording victory, but the North devoured record itself. For centuries, the region where Eric the Red-Handed vanished remained a blank on maps. Not unknown, but ignored. It wasn't that explorers couldn't enter. It was that they found nothing worth writing. The land seemed to erase their observations, their instruments, their certainty. When cartographers finally traced its borders in the 13th century, they called it Skogheimar, the realm of the woods. Not kingdom, not territory, realm. An acknowledgement that it possessed its own sovereignty. Archaeological teams, centuries later, would confirm what the sagas only hinted at. Beneath the ice lay organized layers of artifacts, Viking iron, Sami bone, animal remains, all arranged in precise grids, as if catalogued intentionally. This was not random burial. It was a system, a frozen archive curated by those who had no need for written history. The Sami had turned the very act of disappearance into documentation. The lesson was devastating. Rome had conquered through law, Vikings through terror. But here, power meant something else entirely: the ability to control what endures. The Sami didn't need to kill thousands or build monuments. They needed only to decide what would be remembered and what would not. To the Norse imagination, this was unbearable. How could warriors who had burned half of Europe simply vanish? The sagas fell silent because their authors could not reconcile the idea of defeat without battle. A lost war could still be sung. An erased one could not. The survivors of Eric's expedition refused to speak of what had happened. Many turned to superstition, carving protective runes against the White Death. Some burned their weapons, fearing they carried the curse of forgetfulness. Others sailed south and never raided again. Their silence became its own monument, a void in the historical record where a legend should have been. Generations later, children in Norway whispered of the Skogamenn, forest men, who could walk without sound and see without eyes. The myth outlived the truth, but within it remained a fragment of reality. The fear of an enemy who didn't need gods, gold, or vengeance, only patience. because patience in the north was deadlier than steel. It outlasted courage, eroded pride, and rewrote memory itself. Centuries passed before scholars connected the dots between the Scottish Picts and the Sami. Across hundreds of miles, both civilizations had mastered the same principle: control through invisibility. They had learned to weaponize their environment, to erase the conqueror's rhythm, and to replace spectacle with stillness. For them, survival wasn't resistance, it was authorship. And that realization carried a truth more terrifying than any massacre. The most powerful defense is not to fight, but to remove your enemy's name from the story entirely. The Vikings' greatest weakness was not arrogance. It was their dependence on memory, their belief that to be feared was to exist. The Sami ended that belief. They didn't burn ships or spill blood. They simply stopped acknowledging them. When history resumed, when new generations began to sing of raids and kings again, this episode was gone. A chapter the North itself refused to remember. Only the land remained, indifferent and silent, its snow hiding the last fragments of a truth that no saga could bear to repeat. And so the forest consumed its invaders, not by hunger, but by authorship. It rewrote them into landscape. And in that transformation, the Vikings ceased to be conquerors. They became evidence. Defeat leaves two choices: to forget or to learn. The Picts had humiliated them. The Sami had erased them. And from those twin wounds, a new kind of Viking emerged. Colder, quieter, more deliberate. If fear could not be escaped, perhaps it could be studied. That was the idea behind a fortress that rose from the Baltic Sea like a wound healing over itself. Its name was Yomsborg. It appeared without legend or builder. No saga records its founding. No skald sang its origin. But the chronicles agree on one point: that Yomsborg was not made for kings or raiders. It was a school. For the first time in Norse history, warfare became curriculum. Recruits were not chosen by lineage or fame, but by endurance. Those who survived the trials became known as the Vikings, a brotherhood that sought not glory, but perfection. They were the antidote to everything that had made the old Vikings vulnerable: pride, noise, impulse. Their creed was simple: he who feels fear shall learn to command it. Yomsborg was designed as both fortress and experiment. Its walls were geometrically precise, aligned with the tides to amplify the sound of the sea into a constant low roar, a reminder of the chaos outside. Within, the silence was absolute. No music, no boasting, no drinking songs. Speech existed only for command. Emotion was a resource, measured and rationed. Those who entered were stripped of names and given numbers. Personal identity was weakness. Memory was distraction. The Vikings did not honor ancestors. They replaced them with method. Every tactic they learned was a reversal of what the Picts and Sami had taught through pain. From the Picts, they studied control of perception, formations that could dissolve and reappear in rhythm, as if the army itself breathed. From the Sami, they learned silence, communication through movement, not voice. From both, they adopted patience, the art of forcing the enemy to move first. But they added something new: administration. They turned fear into ledger. Every drill, every failure, Every heartbeat under stress was recorded. Over years, the fortress became less a barracks than a laboratory of discipline. The Vikings measured what others called courage. They quantified it. Their founder was known only as the lawgiver. Some said he had once served under Magnus Bloodaxe and survived the Pictish campaign. Others believed he was the son of one of Eric's lost raiders. Whoever he was, he understood what no warlord before him had grasped. That emotion could be engineered. He issued decrees, written not in verse, but in code. No man shall draw sword in anger. No command shall rely on noise. No warrior shall strike for honor. Victory is obedience executed to perfection. The transformation was radical. In an age where fame meant survival, the Vikings rejected glory entirely. They fought not as heroes, but as mechanisms. To the outside world, this looked monstrous. Vikings who had erased their own souls. But within Yomsborg, it was seen as purification, fear harnessed until it became law. Their training bordered on ritual. Warriors meditated standing waist-deep in freezing water for hours, learning to command their breath until even the body obeyed discipline. At night, they were woken without warning to fight in total darkness, guided only by instinct and memory. Every test sought to remove reaction, to replace it with prediction. The fortress itself enforced obedience. Doors opened only at precise intervals, controlled by weighted stones that mirrored tidal patterns. The same discipline that had once belonged to religion now belonged to routine. Faith was replaced by repetition, and repetition became worship. Within a generation, Yomsborg produced soldiers unlike any the North had seen. They didn't chant, they didn't plunder, they executed. Their raids were silent, brief, methodical, so efficient that chroniclers began calling them the quiet storms. But the greatest weapon Yomsborg forged was psychological. The Vikings understood what their ancestors never had. That power is not the absence of fear, but its ownership. They cultivated it deliberately, trained to feel fear, trace its contours, and turn it outward. Where old Vikings shouted to terrify, these men whispered, and the whisper travelled farther. By the end of the 10th century, the fortress had become legend. Foreign merchants who sailed near its coast reported strange lights, torches burning in synchronized rows along the battlements, extinguishing and reigniting in perfect rhythm. The sea around Yomsborg was always calm, as if the wind itself respected the order within. But the lawgiver's design had one flaw. He had built an army without individuality, a system so efficient it no longer questioned purpose. Perfection, once achieved, becomes sterile, and sterility breeds rebellion. Fear, once mastered, seeks new direction. The Vikings began to look outward, searching for an opponent worthy of their precision. They would find one, their own reflection. The battle began before the first weapon was drawn. It began the moment Thorvald Skullsplitter saw Yomsborg. From the sea, the fortress looked alive, walls breathing with the rhythm of the waves, banners unmoving in the wind. The structure seemed less built than grown, a geometry of discipline imposed on the chaos of tide and stone. To Thorvald, it was an insult. The sea belonged to the loud, to those who shouted their names against storms. This silence, this stillness, was treason against everything the North had been. He commanded 200 men, veterans of raids from Ireland to Ross. They wore bright mail, carried heavy axes, and bore scars like trophies. Their noise filled the coast long before they landed. The clang of armor, the clash of shields, the ancient chorus of conquest. But the fortress made no reply. No defenders stood at its gates, no horns sounded from its towers. Only the sea and that quiet, steady breathing. At dawn, Thorvald advanced. The beach was narrow, flanked by cliffs, the air so still that every step echoed. Halfway to the walls, he ordered a halt. Something was wrong. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening. Then they appeared. Lines of warriors in blackened mail stepped out from the fortress. Slow, precise, identical. Each movement mirrored the next. Shields rising, feet shifting, spears leveling at the same angle. There were no shouts, no taunts, not even faces. Only uniformity. To Thorvald's men, it was like watching their own reflections stripped of passion. He roared, raising his axe. "Let them see what living men look like!" The charge thundered forward, a flood of noise and rage. For a heartbeat, it seemed unstoppable. But when steel met formation, the sound changed. The Vikings absorbed the impact like water taking shape around stone. Each blow landed, but none found chaos to feed on. Where a shield shattered, another filled the gap before the splinters hit the ground. Where one man fell, two stepped forward to close the line. There were no cries, no bloodlust, only execution. Thorvald swung wildly, cutting down an enemy, but his triumph died in silence. The fallen warrior was replaced instantly, the same expressionless mask, the same rhythm. It was as if the dead had been rewritten. He realized then, he wasn't fighting men, he was fighting a system. The Vikings moved with impossible synchronization, turning the battlefield into a clockwork mechanism. Commands traveled through gesture, through breath, through the measured exchange of weight. Every motion had consequence. Every pause, calculation. Their silence became oppressive, louder than any battle cry. Thorvald's warriors, uncoordinated and furious, began to unravel. They tripped over corpses, swung at air, shouted over one another. The noise that had once been their strength now betrayed them. Each scream revealing position, each boast inviting a counterstrike. The chaos that had conquered Europe was devouring itself. By midday, the beach was red and quiet. The tide washed through armor and ash, pulling the dead back toward the sea. Of Thorvald's 200, fewer than 50 still stood. The Vikings had lost fewer than 20, not because they were stronger, but because they refused to break pattern. In the distance, the lawgiver watched from the ramparts, his cloak motionless in the wind. He did not command, because he didn't need to. His fortress had become self-sustaining, the doctrine of discipline functioning without voice. When the fighting stopped, Thorvald found himself surrounded. He expected mockery, perhaps a speech, but none came. The Vikings simply stepped aside, opening a corridor toward the sea. Permission to retreat, or command to carry the message. He understood which. He limped through the corridor, passing ranks of faces that were neither cruel nor merciful, merely unbothered, each one identical, as if forged from a single design. Behind him, his surviving men followed in silence, stripped of pride, of certainty, of myth. At the shoreline, Thorvald turned to look one last time. The Vikings stood motionless, blades lowered, formation perfect. The sun glinted off their armor like polished obsidian. No victory cries, no banners raised. They had won, and victory meant nothing. Only completion mattered. Thorvald knelt, scooped a handful of wet sand, and let it fall through his fingers. It felt like time itself, slipping, inevitable. He had witnessed the end of the old order. The wild Viking spirit that had terrified Europe had met its perfected form and found it unbearable. In that moment, he understood the lawgiver's vision. Fear was not to be avoided. It was to be mastered, systematized, industrialized. The Vikings had taken the chaos that once defined them and turned it into machine logic. They were no longer men who fought wars. They were wars that no longer needed men. When Thorvald's ship finally left the coast, the fortress disappeared into the mist, its black outline merging with the sea. Some said it sank, others that it still stood, training the next generation in silence. But among the survivors, one truth spread faster than rumor. The loudest army in the world was defeated by those who no longer needed to speak. That was the final inversion. The Vikings had once conquered through spectacle. Now they had been conquered by its absence. And from that silence, a new philosophy was born. One that would shape the future of warfare long after the last longship rotted on northern shores. Fear is the first law. Discipline is its throne. Every empire eventually studies what it once called weakness. For the Vikings, that study began with defeat. The Picts had shown them that terror could be structured. The Sami proved that destruction could occur without contact. And the Vikings demonstrated the final lesson, that mastery lies not in erasing fear, but in administering it. Across these three encounters, fear evolved from emotion to architecture. It began as panic, became a weapon, and ended as a system. By the time the sagas resumed, centuries later, the North had changed. Less chaotic, less impulsive, and infinitely more disciplined. The transformation was not immediate, nor conscious. It was generational, the slow inheritance of survival through imitation. In Scotland, the Vikings met design. The Picts proved that fear could be planned like a fortification. Every tower, every silence, every ritual was calibrated to control attention. The Vikings entered that system believing strength was noise. They left knowing that stillness could command obedience. For the first time, they encountered the mathematics of intimidation, how the right distance, the right angle, the right pause could produce panic more efficiently than an army. From that point forward, Viking raids began to change. They mapped coastlines with greater precision. They built landing camps according to geometry rather than instinct. Their ships became less ornamental, more functional. The Picts had infected them with calculation. The forest wars of Finland transformed that lesson into something colder. Where the Picts used design, the Sami used ecology. They taught that power required no symbols, no cities, no noise, only patience. To command the environment was to command the mind. By erasing movement, by removing evidence, they proved that absence could dominate more completely than presence. From them, the Vikings learned reconnaissance, how to watch without being seen. The early explorers of Greenland and Finland carried Sami principles with them. Silence, restraint, adaptability. Even their mythology shifted. Old gods of thunder gave way to subtler spirits, Odin the Wanderer replacing Thor the Destroyer. The divine had learned to whisper. Yomsborg completed the cycle. Where the Picts built the architecture of fear, and the Sami dissolved it into nature, the Vikings turned it inward. They industrialized emotion. Discipline replaced rage. Rhythm replaced inspiration. They turned warriors into algorithms, each movement predetermined, each impulse refined away. What began as survival became ideology. The Vikings treated fear not as enemy, but as teacher. Their drills forced men to stand within fear's presence until they understood its grammar, when it rises, how it spreads, what it demands. Once measured, it could be redistributed. That insight would echo across centuries, shaping every organized army to come. Fear, in its purest form, is information. The mind acknowledging uncertainty. The Picts, Sami, and Vikings each transformed that information into policy. They taught that the most stable power is not built on conquest, but on predictability, a terror so consistent it becomes law. What Rome once called order, what later kingdoms would call civilization, began here, in the cold laboratories of survival. By turning fear into system, they also transformed identity. The Vikings who returned from these wars no longer saw themselves as divine predators. They became administrators of risk, merchants, navigators, settlers. Where once they sought to dominate others, they now sought to master themselves. And that, paradoxically, made them more dangerous. Because a civilization that has conquered its own fear no longer fights for glory. It fights for continuity. But every system inherits the cruelty of its origin. What the Picts used to protect, later rulers used to control. What the Sami used for balance became strategy for surveillance. What the Vikings designed for discipline became doctrine for obedience. The modern world would perfect these lessons, not on battlefields, but in offices, borders, and bureaucracies. Fear would no longer scream. It would whisper through policy, through paperwork, through silence enforced by design. The same geometry, the same absence, the same quiet synchronization, refined and renamed as order. The bones of the Old North had predicted it all. Centuries after the last longship rotted, archaeologists would uncover remnants of Yomsborg, weapon fragments aligned with astronomical precision, inscriptions resembling timetables rather than prayers. They called it the birthplace of Northern administration. But buried beneath that title was an older truth, that the first bureaucrats of fear were not kings, but survivors. And so, through defeat, the Vikings discovered what empires never admit, that fear is not failure, but function. It organizes chaos, disciplines pride, and records obedience. The Picts taught them to design it. The Sami taught them to hide within it. The Vikings taught them to live by it. In that education lay the true transformation of the North. From raiders to rulers, from predators to systems, from myth to method. The age of conquest had ended. The age of control had begun. History remembers noise. It records kings, invasions, and victories. But beneath that noise runs another record, a quieter one, written in absence. Not in parchment or stone, but in the spaces where fear taught restraint. The Vikings, the masters of noise, left behind both. Their swords rusted, their silence endured. They began as fire, chaotic, radiant, uncontainable. But every flame eventually meets geometry. The Picts gave it walls, the Sami gave it wind, the Yomsvikings gave it law. Together, they transformed violence into architecture. The result was not peace. It was something colder, stability. That was the true lesson of the Northern Wars. Fear is not the opposite of power. It is its memory. Every fortress, every border, every uniform ever designed was an echo of those first encounters. The understanding that control begins where courage ends. When Magnus Bloodaxe rode into the Pictish forests, he believed terror was something he could wield. When Eric the Red-Handed entered the Sami wilderness, he thought the world itself could be dominated. When the lawgiver built Yomsborg, he sought to trap fear inside stone. None of them succeeded, but each contributed to something larger, the slow professionalization of fear. By the 12th century, that process had replaced the warrior with the soldier, the raid with the rule, the scream with the schedule. Where a Viking once killed for reputation, a bureaucrat now signed in ink. Pain became predictable. The world for the first time felt safe, and therefore manageable. But safety too was fear by another name. Because once fear is organized, it doesn't disappear. It changes owner. The Vikings had once thought their gods demanded glory, but what the Picts, Sami and Jomsvikings revealed was subtler. The gods demanded order. Even chaos has a cost, and someone must keep the ledger. That ledger became the foundation of Europe's later empires. Rome reborn through discipline, Scandinavia refined through restraint. The same mind that once built longships would later build laws, contracts, ledgers, prisons. Each one a descendant of Yomsborg's geometry. The line between fear and administration blurred until it vanished. Every register, every oath, every census was an echo of that fortress logic. If fear can be measured, it can be managed. That principle still governs nations today. Only the language has changed. What the North once called terror, modernity calls security. What was once obedience, we call efficiency. And what was once erasure, we call progress. The design endures, the vocabulary evolves, the system remains. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered a tablet in Yomsborg's ruins. Its inscription was simple: all sound must serve. No other words survived. But in that fragment lies the story of an entire civilization learning to replace emotion with mechanism. The Vikings had sought to escape fear. Instead, they became its archivists. The irony is cruel and perfect. Those who once made Europe tremble learned that power thrives not in chaos, but in its regulation. They who burned monasteries ended by building their own, silent, disciplined, dedicated to order. The age of raiders became the age of clerks, and the howl of the berserker was replaced by the quill-scratching ledgers. From terror to taxation, a seamless evolution. So when we ask, what happens when the most feared warriors in history finally meet something greater than their fear? The answer is not defeat. It is transformation. Fear did not destroy the Vikings. It taught them how to endure. It taught them to turn the unpredictable into the predictable, and in doing so, to found the first true architecture of control. The Picts drew its geometry. The Sami mapped its silence. The Vikings codified its rhythm. Together, they built the modern world's invisible cathedral, a world that no longer fears death, only disorder. That is their legacy, and ours. Every law we obey, every form we sign, every silence we accept, all descend from those ancient lessons of control born in the cold. The age of the sword ended not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. The blade became the pen, and the scream became policy. And somewhere beneath all that order, the Old North still whispers. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak.